Good morning and welcome to all the participants in our webinar on social innovation for migrant integration. We're very pleased to see that so many could join us for this event today. My name is Geertre Lano. I work as migrant integration and labor migration expert at the IOM regional office in Brussels, and I will be your moderator for the webinar today. Today, we're going to talk about social innovation for migrant integration. And in particular, we will look at how social innovation has helped to improve migrant inclusion at a local level in European cities. The event is organized in the context of our Admin for All project. It's a project that aims to support inclusion of migrants at a local level in Europe, and it's funded by the European Union, in particular the Directorate General for Employment and Social Inclusion. So when cities were confronted with increased numbers of arrivals in 2015, 2016, we saw many interesting and innovative practices emerging. It's of course at a local level that migrant integration has to happen, and many cities have been very innovative in trying to find responses to the needs of the newcomers. We do see, however, new challenges arising due to the current pandemic. COVID-19 has highly, restricted possibilities of interaction. For example, it has also, made it more difficult to reach out to migrant communities during the pandemic. So in today's webinar, we're going to explore, on the one hand, some of these interesting models of social innovation that we've seen emerging in European cities. And on the other hand, we're also going to look at what is now the impact also of the current pandemic on those. So we will start today with a welcoming remark by Mr. Schwarz, who's the head of the Social Investment Strategy Unit at DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. After that, we will hear from Rosella Chelmi, who is the project manager of the Admin for All project, and who will explain us a bit more about the Admin for All support for European cities on migrant inclusion. And then we will hear about the results of a study that we have conducted with MPI Europe under the Admin for All project. And this study is looking at social innovation for migrant integration and based on interviews with representatives in different European cities. So Liam Patuzzi, who's a policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute Europe, will present us the findings of this research. And finally, we will have a panel where we'll hear about some of these interesting innovative practices on the ground. We have three panelists with us today: Roberta Lo Bianco, David Lebel, and Maria Amélie. All of them are involved in innovative actions at a local level or are even social entrepreneurs themselves. So I'm very much looking forward to hear from all our speakers today. I also want to tell you, the participants, that of course we also welcome your interaction. So if you have any questions you would like to ask to any of the panelists, feel free. There is a chat function, so you can simply enter your question or comment in the chat. Kindly do select all panelists. If you send it to all panelists, I will also receive it and I'm able to relay your question back to the panelists. So do not send it to an individual speaker, just send it to all panelists. So with that, I think we're ready to start our webinar. I see there now 140 participants online, so I think it's a good moment to start. So I would like to ask Mr. Jiří Schwarz, who's the head of the Social Investment Strategy Unit at the Director General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion of the European Commission, to join us. Now, in this function, Mr. Schwarz supervises the provision of policy guidance to member states on social policies, but also including policies on fighting, for example, poverty, social inclusion, inequalities. So we are very grateful for the support of DG Employment for this project to make admin for all possible. Mr. Schwarz, you have the floor.
Hi, hello everybody. Thank you for a nice introduction, Hetri. So let me then, as I was invited to the opening remarks, have a few hopefully inspiring comments for the for today's webinar. I'm very honored to be able to open the event, and I would like to thank IOM for organizing and inviting me and many other participants to this webinar. It's a very high number of participation, so the word on innovation in terms of migrant inclusion and integration will hopefully spread very wide. First of all, I think it's important to give you a message from the Commission that we're strongly committed to first migrant integration and inclusion per se, but also with engaging with stakeholders, be it on the government, local, regional, or non-governmental level, because we are all aware that this complex challenge needs mobilization of many of you and many of us. Dealing with the migrant inclusion and integration is, and you know better, is extremely diverse and challenging, and it requires ongoing adaptation of our mainstream working methods, and that is why the innovative solutions or socially innovative solutions are key here. It is all about implementation on the ground, where the inclusion processes primarily take place. So the participation of practitioners from local levels is very important to make sure that we end up with efficient integration of migrants. Integration policies are in place in many, if not all, member states, and they are bringing some positive results. But it's apparent that there are still very important gaps between migrant and native populations. And the challenges are still substantial, especially when it comes to labor market integration, but also integration to our societies. In particular, young people, young migrants or migrant women call for particular attention here. There's still, unfortunately, too many households with migrant background that still face challenges of unemployment, limited education or training opportunities, or limited social interactions with the rest of the society. There is still important employment gap. About 14% between native born and population with migrant background. Similarly, the poverty gap is even higher. It's almost a double. So people with migrant backgrounds are twice as likely to end up in poverty and social exclusion than the native-born population. And it's needless to say that the COVID pandemic is very likely to worsen these figures and maybe widen the gap. But I hope that with our continued efforts, we will be able to reverse the trend. The working on innovative solutions is something that we have, as at the Commission or at DG Employment, been looking for some time already. We are funding since 2017 5 innovative projects that should be some sort of pilots on testing different approaches. These are projects between 2-3 million euro in Italy, Germany, Sweden, Bulgaria. So we hope that this will provide for some inspiration, and I hope we'll be able to present some results of these projects very soon. This brings me to the, so to say, most topical issue, and that is that the Commission yesterday has proposed a new pact on migration and asylum. It is one of the key deliverables of this college under the President von der Leyen. It is a very big package of a number of legislative and non-legislative proposals that will sort of shape the discussion at EU level for some time. It's a fresh start. One of the areas, and I will not aim to try to describe or analyze the pact, because this would certainly take much more time than I have, but maybe focus on a few points that are of relevance here. There is a relatively strong focus on skills. The pact proposes to establish talent partnership with third countries, which should reinforce the legal migration pathways, and at the same time attempts to address the EU skills and labor market needs. The pact also aims to complete the unfinished work on reforming the EU Blue Card Directive. The reform must bring real EU value added in terms of attracting skills through effective EU-wide instruments. The pact also foresees proposal for skills and talent package, including revision of long-term residence directive, single permit directive, and also aims to develop EU talent pool for third country skilled workers. In more broader context, the pact provides for a comprehensive approach, bringing together areas of migration, asylum processes, border management, and also integration. It seeks to create, say, more operational, faster migration processes with sort of strong governance elements supported by modern IT tools, and also strengthening the work of the EU agencies, Frontex among them. The pact also aims to reduce unsafe and irregular routes, and by promoting more sustainable and safe legal pathways for migration. We count on the support of all of you, of the member states, to make sure that we can deliver on all these elements of the package. one particular element, and this is something that has a sort of work stream on its own, is integration and inclusion. We recognize that it is a challenging exercise, and that is why this work stream will have a separate action plan, which would be presented by the end of this year. There is an ongoing consultation, which I believe ends in about 1 month's time. So everybody is welcome to contribute. And in terms of, I should not forget to say that in terms of integration and inclusion, EU has been supporting this with funding and will continue to do so under the new funding instruments, which are now being discussed with the legislators. So these are namely European Social Fund and Asylum and Migration Fund. These are obviously most relevant ones, but there are other funds that can contribute, Regional Development Fund and others.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Svarc, because I see there are already some questions popping up in the chat. So clearly a lot of interest from the participants in what you have to say. And I thank you also for reminding all of us that people with a migrant background still face some challenges indeed when it comes to, having, higher risk of ending up in poverty, social exclusion, problems in terms of employment. So we should not forget that. And it's also for this that we welcome, of course, the initiative of the European Commission to launch a new action plan on integration. I see some participants are asking about the details of the consultation. So we will provide in the chat the link to the consultation. As Mr. Svarc indicated, the consultation is still open for another month, and we welcome, all participants, particularly also cities, local authorities, but also NGOs to participate to this consultation. So please do check that out. And I think we can also provide in the chat the link to the new pact that was also mentioned by Mr. Svarc, the Pact on Migration and Asylum, that amongst others also look at questions related to inclusion, but also, skills mobility and legal migration. So thank you so much, Mr. Svarc, and to the participants who asked the questions. We will soon input the answers to your questions in the chat with the link also to the consultation on integration. Thank you so much, Mr. Svarc. We're happy that you could join us for this event. We'll now move on to Rossella Chelmi, who's the coordinator of the Admin for All project, and she will explain us a bit more about the support that Admin for All is giving to municipalities in Europe on migrant inclusion. And in particular, she will also explain what we have done in terms of, supporting municipalities in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Rossella, the floor is yours.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much, Gertra. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, participants. So I will give you a brief overview of the main results of the Admin for All project, actually. The program aims to indeed enhance the capacities of local entities, in particular municipalities, across the EU to provide accessible services and, of course, looking into successful policies in favor of social and economic integration of migrants. In particular, the project, we are running the second phase. We started in 2016. In 2008, thanks to the support of DG Employment, we have decided to continue the action of capacity building support to local authorities. And we indeed are approaching the final phase of the program. As said, the project actually provides three different components. In particular, We are providing support in terms of trainings and capacity building activities for the 33 cities involved in the project in 7 different EU member states. The capacity building actually is a component, it is the result of a scoping study and also needs assessment that until the very beginning, let's say since the very beginning of the project, we have designed with the local municipalities. We are also providing support to local coordination initiatives and mechanisms. In particular, 7 pilot initiatives at the moment are funded thanks to the project and are ongoing. And the third component, let's say, the international exchanges and the research. Today we are here for the presentation of the second paper on social innovation for migrant inclusion in collaboration with the Migration Policy Institute. Indeed, also in May, we launched the first paper that was on the local governance model for integration of migrants. But we also had the opportunity actually to implement a regional European consultation last October in 2019, where more than 100 of integration stakeholders and municipal representatives attended in order to discuss and share possible solutions to common challenges related to migrant integration. And a plan of 17 peer exchange visits was among several municipalities was ready, actually suspended for the COVID-19 pandemic. The geographical scope of the project, as I said, we are involving more than several municipalities, actually in 7 different member states, Italy, Austria, Poland, Romania, Greece, Spain and Malta, among which municipalities are located in, as you can see from the list of the cities, in several areas. So we have the opportunity to compare different dynamics related to migration and also integration policies. And we also believe that the added value of the project per se is indeed the geographical overview in terms of comparison of cities and policies in different cities in the southern, but also central and eastern Europe context. If we look into the first research paper outcomes, in particular, as I said, we launched in May, and the first paper was on the new and emerging governance models for migrant inclusion. In particular, we have analyzed 5 key areas of policy development and interventions. And indeed, we believe that it's also very important in order to address different needs of diverse groups to define a common understanding of the mainstreaming policies and diversity on and inclusion of migrants.
Thank you, Rossella. Is it perhaps possible to also say something about the COVID-19 impact and what that means for all did around that? Because I'm mindful of our time, and I think this is an important question that perhaps participants have.
That was the next slide, in order to give an idea of the adaptation of the activities. Let's say that as soon as we realized that for the restrictions and the spread of the pandemic, we trying to assess with the local municipalities involved in our project what kind of activities we were, ready to also implement and design with them in order to respond to emerging needs of the most vulnerable migrant population. And indeed, we translated info materials in more than 30 languages. We shared with all the municipalities involved in order to provide information related to the COVID-19. But we also improve the capacity of our online community of practices. We will show you in a minute some details and also references related to the practices, to the online practices. And indeed, this is will be a virtual space where the municipalities, but also other relevant stakeholders can meet each other, share experiences, common challenges, and possible common solutions. And the third phase that we tried also to adapt to the ongoing emergency is, of course, the engagement of the local municipalities. We design a sort of rapid assessment of needs in terms of, let's say, impact, how to measure with the municipalities the impact of the COVID on the migrants' access to services. And as I said, on the Admin for All website, you can also find the in the section news, there is a subsection COVID-19. You can find the leaflet translated in languages. And also video and audio materials. In order, we decided also to provide some visual communication tools to migrants and to the municipalities in order to make the information, you know, as small as understandable in terms of cultural and linguistic sensitiveness. And as I mentioned before, we also enhance the capacity of the online community of practice. Indeed, you can find an interactive community space. At the moment, IOM experts and also municipalities and some other relevant national authorities requested the access. So we are trying also to build a common approach to the use of this online tool, and we hope that in the coming months we will also improve the access of other authorities interested to participate to the online community. And then just the last point to give you an idea on where we are with the rapid assessment and the surveys that we are implementing with the support of the IOM missions located in the countries involved in the project. Still at the moment we have 22 municipalities that completed the survey. That was in terms of, let's say, design was divided into some relevant key issues like what kind of needs you see in order to better address the post-emergency integration challenges. We tried also to give some evidence of the need to look into the medium and long-term impact of the emergency, because we are also aware of the social and economical impact of the COVID-19 on migrants' populations. And just to give you an idea, still, as said, ongoing the analysis. But we already realized that it's very important for municipalities to capitalize funding mechanism, and still the budget gaps related to integration policies is quite evident. But the idea is to enhance external and internal coordination mechanisms in order to build, for example, fruitful partnership with NGOs, but also at the internal level to create a sort of communication and coordination mechanism amongst different departments related to the inclusion of vulnerable groups. So thank you for your attention. Of course, I remain available with the project team if you have any other questions. And so, Gertra, I leave to you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rosella, and thank you in particular for explaining also, what Admin for All has done in response to COVID-19. I see some reflections already in the chat. Somebody is noting that indeed these tools are very useful. All the participants, you can find in the chat also the links to the tools that Rosella mentioned, but also to the publication on governance models for integration. Also, one of the participants noted that there is also useful information. There's a resource hub for cities responding to COVID-19 on the Majors Migration Council website, so you will find that as well in the chat. So thank you so much, Rosella. I think it's now time for us to actually look at the second research paper that has been produced under Admin for All, and this research conducted by Liam Patuzzi, who's a policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute in Europe, looks particularly at social innovation for migrant integration. Now, Liam, we know you've been in touch with many cities under the Admin for All project to identify some of these innovative practices that cities have put in place to support the social inclusion of newcomers. We're very eager to hear more on that. Liam, please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Gertra. And thank you all to the previous speakers for introducing this. It's really an honor to be here and to be able to present these findings. So thank you, Mr. Schwarz. Thank you, Rosella. Driving migrant inclusion through social innovation, lessons for cities in a pandemic. This is the title of the report that is also published today. I would also like to clarify that although I led on this research, my colleagues at MPI Europe, at MPI, and also at IOM proved really valuable in providing support and feedback. And of course, I would also like to thank all the cities that were involved and all the partners and stakeholders that I was able to talk to during this research. So despite the title that mentioned lessons for cities in a pandemic, I think what I will try to do here today is not to provide lessons. I know that we have many participants in this webinar that are certainly also more knowledgeable than me or have more direct insights in what cities are doing at the moment, particularly to contain and mitigate the effects of the pandemic on their local communities, and in particular for the discussion that we're having today, the effects on vulnerable groups such as migrants and refugees. But I would like to give you some quick insights into our research. Of course, I hope this will make you curious to consult the full report and to spark a bit of a discussion based on this. So just as an introduction, and as Gertra already mentioned, this is the second paper that we are publishing for the Admin for All. The first one that we released in May looked at models of local governance in different European cities, and based on the same sample of cities that you can see here in the picture, we conducted a second study on social innovation. So we conducted approximately 50 interviews, visiting 3 cities for in-person interviews. So these 3 cities were Milan, Thessaloniki, and Warsaw. So a special thanks to these 3. And yes, that was still when this was possible to travel places and do these interviews in person. In the other ones, we conducted interviews telephonically, so about 50 interviews. Of course, I also encourage you to check out the first paper published back in May. So yes, let's have a quick look at the goals of the study. We wanted to look, after looking at models of local governance, in this case, we wanted to look particularly on how local authorities and cities can leverage synergies with, let's say, untraditional players, non-state players, such as the ones listed here, civil society, businesses, migrant associations, innovative social enterprises, and also local residents themselves and their informal engagement. So we know that this has been a very lively field in cities, especially after 2015 and 2016 and the spike of arrivals of both migrants and refugees around that time. Cities tried to engage in more innovative collaborations to mobilize resources quickly and also to try to respond to urgent needs such as accommodation and healthcare of newcomers. And later on, of course, also to promote more durable integration. Often having to face also gaps in service provision and to compensate for some limitations of national responses, particularly in the most urgent phase of new arrivals. So what we try to do is to address several questions, such as what characterizes these models of social innovation? Are they very different from city to city, or is there a clear common thread? How do they interact with mainstream services, for instance, of employment support, of healthcare, of counseling? And particularly, what are their ingredients for success, and how is this success measured and evaluated? Of course, we also then adapted our goals. Partly, we had not predicted that 2020 will bring us the outbreak of COVID-19 when we started this research. And by that time, we had already concluded most of our field work. Still, we thought it would be worth to seize this opportunity to reflect on how cities facing the pandemic can build on the experiments of the past, let's say, 5 years to promote cohesive communities, especially in a time in which vulnerabilities are more exposed than ever among populations that are already, let's say, in a normal scenario, under quite some disadvantage. But more on this in a minute. I would first like to start very quickly because I know many of us still have some doubts when we talk about social innovation. What does it exactly mean? It is a bit of a slippery term sometimes, a little vague, a little blurry. So the definition of social innovation that we used primarily is a definition from the social innovation community, which contains these two elements, let's say the what element and the how element. So social innovation seen as the development of new products, services, or processes to meet a social need, to address a social challenge. And very importantly, this is done in a way that optimizes resources and relationships available in a society. So exactly the point that I mentioned, looking beyond governments, at the local level in particular, looking what are the resources, the partners available there, what are instances of engagement that can also be leveraged in a situation particularly of funding constraints or, let's say, narrow regulatory leeways in which cities could move. When applied to integration policy, this can mean different things, of course, and I will get deeper into that in a minute, but probably the most important is the evolution from government as the sole or primary locus of community building and service provision, and towards a more decentralized and collaborative approach to these challenges. So as mentioned here, tapping expertise outside of government, also leveraging, for instance, new technologies, which was a very lively sphere of action in the post-2015-16 to meet challenges of migrant and refugee inclusion. And yes, the stronger involvement of receiving communities. Another one that is not mentioned here is also to kind of like break or reduce this barrier between, let's say, service providers and target groups by more regularly and more consistently involving supposed target groups in designing solutions to their needs. So moving to the next slide, why lessons for cities in a pandemic? Why did we opt for this framing? Well, obviously, this was a decision also in terms of topicality. It was just a topic that we could not look away from, as cities were starting to face more and more these challenges brought by COVID. But of course, our underlying rationale here was also that there are some parallels between 2015 and 16 and the current situation that might justify this link. We know that innovation often comes as a byproduct of emergency, and of course, by no means do we try to say that these are fully comparable situations. Although the spike in arrivals in 2015 and 16 did create some considerable challenges for many transit and destination cities across Europe, especially as the limits of national responses became evident particularly in the initial phase of highest urgency and emergency. What we are facing now with COVID-19 is obviously has a different quality, has a much more pervasive nature with its impacts across societies and economies. However, it is still interesting looking at whether innovation ecosystems that originated back then can help cities navigate the current times out of different reasons, which are listed here. And I could summarize just by saying that cities that are under time pressure, financial pressure, and also face a more delicate political environment and potentially a more sensitive and volatile public opinion can really learn from solutions that, let's say, were born in a context that was exactly calling for approaches that could navigate these constraints and basically strike a balance between efficacy and also cost effectiveness, and also, let's say, leveraging pools of resources that went well beyond, let's say, what local institutions had within their institutional DNA. Moving to the next slide, I will not go over these extensively because, of course, you can find much more detailed descriptions and many examples in our report released today. But just to give you a few examples that can express the range of players and solutions that we looked at in all these different cities. So as you can see, the main areas that we tried to classify these approaches along were supporting the most vulnerable and hard to reach populations with innovative models, involving and engaging receiving communities in a way that is sustainable and makes the most of their contribution, for example, through neighborhood-based approaches, and also by sustaining and encouraging and professionalizing volunteerism. A key one, of course, already mentioned before, was building untraditional partnerships. And here we were especially interested in looking at the partnerships that, let's say, have a newer quality or are still a little more fragile in this realm, such as those with the private sector, as well as with usually more neglected parts of civil society, such as migrant associations. And then, of course, co-creation of services, the aspect that I mentioned earlier about reducing this division, this binary between service providers or host societies and target groups or migrants and refugees, and designing solutions together. Just a few examples here for hard-to-reach populations. For instance, one example that fosters autonomy around the sense of home was or is the project in Milan Central Station Help Center, which is a service point for homeless, destitute, and marginalized residents, which is run jointly by the city and civil society organizations. And this has successfully built on the Housing First approach that was already successful internationally, such as in North America or Northern Europe, providing an immediate street-to-home transition for homeless migrants and also other residents with addictions, mental health conditions, and also other issues such as victims of trafficking and unaccompanied minors. An example of involvement of the private sector that we found very interesting, especially in a city with a still relatively nascent, let's say, infrastructure for migrant integration, was in Bucharest, where MasterCard partnered with IOM to provide financial education and inclusion training for migrants and refugees, and also started projects to provide, for instance, prepaid cards for refugees to simplify the transfer of benefits. So we see from here that innovation, the social innovation infrastructure from 2015 and 2016 could potentially be the ticket to a more cost-effective and politically viable response in times of the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, the neighborhood-based models that we found, for example, in Malaga, could help organize and sustain the surge of highly localized community engagement that the pandemic has sparked in many cities. And these highly localized and place-based approaches could also turn out to be a less controversial way to continue addressing the needs of refugees and migrants, as possibly targeted measures for these populations might become harder to justify politically. On the other hand, these ecosystems are still fragile, and COVID-19 could be a make or break moment for them. For instance, solutions that are based on a close social contact or interpersonal interaction, such as community building solutions, really face massive challenges at the moment due to social distancing measures, but also solutions that provide holistic services, for instance, combining housing, training, psychosocial counseling, and employment, could be much more difficult to implement now, as they tend usually to focus on high intensity support and on quality rather than on quantity, and therefore in a situation of let's say budgetary pressures, they might be much harder to continue. And so I will just move to my last slide, and then I will conclude with this. This one. What have we, or what can we draw from looking at these solutions of social innovation, applying them to the current situation in terms of what their current limitations are and how to basically strengthen them so that we can really maximize their potential for the current challenge? Well, on one hand, what we concluded was that there is a great variety of innovations, let's say of very interesting approaches in different cities. However, these ecosystems are often still fragile. Yes, there is a wealth of scattered, interesting approaches rather than really a systematic way to go at them that would also make it easier to replicate them and to scale them and to transfer them to different contexts. And therefore, the current pandemic really puts this still nascent infrastructure at risk. And therefore, local governments would be well advised to tackle the hard questions, we call them, of effectiveness, sustainability, efficiency, and scalability to guarantee the survival of the most promising initiatives. And so this would mean to be strategic, to bring together scattered initiatives and help them perform evaluations, for instance, help them diversify their funding, and also help them design pathways to scale. A second limitation that we identified, just a couple of minutes, and then I will conclude, is that there has been a spike in community engagement, more informal one, due to the current pandemic, but cities are often a bit inexperienced when it comes to engaging with these smaller and looser community initiatives. And so, for instance, what would be worth exploring here is a better use of channels, for instance, also digital channels to engage these initiatives in a time of social distancing, and also investments in capacity building and training to allow these newly formed models and engagement initiatives to survive and have a more durable impact. And finally, COVID-19 might make it harder to invest directly into targeted services for migrants and refugees because, let's say, in a context of ongoing health risks, service cuts, and unemployment for wider populations, investing into targeted measures may trigger backlash from local communities. We suggested moving from social innovation for migrant inclusion to inclusive social innovation. And this would mean applying co-creation methods to designing solutions to COVID-19 related challenges, and more concretely, potentially involving migrant associations, migrant organizations in designing these solutions and these pathways to recovery. This would both ensure that the contribution of migrants and refugees as members, as integral members of the community is more visible and more recognized. And at the same time, it will also ensure that relief packages and stimulus packages developed at local level, but really at all levels of government, take into account the needs of migrants and refugees, potentially without being specifically targeted to them. So this would be it for now. Sorry that I went a little bit over time, but yeah, really happy to engage in the conversation afterwards. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Liam. It's indeed not easy to summarize, a long research report in just a 10 minutes presentation, but I think you did very well. And I particularly also like, your conclusion saying that we should have inclusive social innovation, because indeed we have to involve migrants and refugees, in designing, the solution to the challenges that newcomers face. I see there's already a question in the chat addressed to you, Liam. The question is, in what way is it certain that these practices are cost effective? And are some of these practices more costly, for example, in terms of time or relation building, or maybe they demand also more political support, for example, from different policy areas? So what's your view on the cost effectiveness?
Yes, thank you so much. So this is a really good question. I would say that our assessment after looking at these practices was that, well, this is a differentiated picture. Indeed, some of them tend to be quite cost intensive because they really place their main focus on quality and comprehensiveness of support. So they try to go beyond what is this sort of like more, let's say, departmental view of support, namely these siloed divisions between employment support, psychological support, healthcare, and so on, to tie all of this together. But of course, this requires at least on the front end, let's say at least in the development phase, very intensive investments into coordination and into model design. However, in terms of cost effectiveness, certainly some of these solutions hold important promise because they let's say, or because they originated exactly in a context and in cities that were facing, let's say, tight budgets within which they could move. Let's remember that. Let's recall that at the time of large arrivals, many cities in Europe were still facing the long tail of, let's say, economic recession that had started in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And so this also brought a lot of creativity in terms of financing models. I will mention here just as an example, the social impact bonds that are an interesting form of collaboration between the public sector, the private sector, and civil society. And in a way, they also spread the financial risk. a little more away from government. And so, yes, there are these solutions that also allow to, for instance, involve businesses into financing models, and therefore to relieve, let's say, the public purse, at least at the time, let's say, of greatest urgency. And therefore, this allows for greater liquidity when front-loaded investments are really necessary.
Liam, I have another question for you that came from the participants that relates to the evaluation. So we talked about the cost effectiveness, but another question is there any impact evaluation of the social innovations, or is there perhaps, a network to support evaluations of these initiatives, because often, a budget doesn't allow for it. So what's your view on that? And also linked to that, were there any migrant-led organizations engaged in the design and evaluation of such integration policies or initiatives? And what are the challenges in getting them involved? I think this indeed relates back to what you said, the inclusive social innovation, to which extent, are migrants or migrant organizations also involved in the design and evaluation of such initiatives or policies. So if that's okay, I would like to ask you to answer very briefly these two questions before we move to our panel. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, very briefly. So the question on evaluation, well, it's one that we have also looked at intensively in some other work that as MPI Europe we have done conferences on social innovation for refugee inclusion and related reports. And this is really, I would say, one of the weak points of social innovation in this area. There are some initiatives, also some funding programs, such as Urban Innovative Actions at EU level, and others that have tried to link funding with better monitoring and measurement of outcomes. So there are certainly developments in this area. I would say that, yes, in the initiatives that we observed, approaches were really different. There wasn't really homogeneity. So this is definitely an area to invest in. What we also found is that even the, let's say, the definition of innovation varies, or the understanding of innovation varies quite a lot between different cities and also different individuals. So sometimes it's just kind of like a more intuitive understanding that is not really, let's say, underpinned by a more systematic definition. So that will also be, let's say, something to consider when devising indicators for measurement, for instance. And on the second point, migrant associations, yes, definitely we found some very interesting examples. I can think now spontaneously of Milan, for instance, and Warsaw, where migrant associations were also directly involved in the provision of municipal social services as partners. Yes, so these are interesting and promising examples. However, they also highlighted some of the weaknesses. Sometimes migrant associations are still in a way pigeonholed as organizations that can only, let's say, bring an added value in the area of, let's say, cultural activities and events, rather than being seen to core as, eye-level partners that can participate, let's say, in devising, for instance, employment strategies, education strategies, and other integration policies. So I'll just stop there. There would be much more to say, but yes.
Thank you very much, Liam. And perhaps also to say that Mr. Schwartz mentioned earlier the consultation on integration, but also there will be a new expert group established to represent the views of migrants when it comes to migration and asylum policy. So migrants and migrant associations, organizations, they're also all invited to apply in this expert group, because this group of experts should represent the views of migrants and consider these in the design of policies. So just wanted to mention that as well, and remind participants that the link to that, both to the consultation and the application for the expert group, is above in the chat. And of course, we also have in the chat the link to the report that Liam just presented on social innovation. So please do feel free to download the report and share it within your networks. And once again, congratulations to Liam for this fantastic research. I think it's now time for us to move on to the panel, because of course we also want to hear about some of these local innovative practices that have been implemented on the ground. And we have 3 speakers in our panel today. First of all, we have David Lubell, who's the founding director of Welcoming International. We have Roberta Lo Bianco, who's working in the European Center for Studies and Initiatives funded in Palermo in Italy. And we have Marie-Amélie, co-founder of Startup Migrants. So I'm inviting all our panelists to join us for this discussion, because we're very eager to hear a bit more about your initiatives on the ground at the local level. David, if you agree, I would like to start with you. David Lubell.
Sure. Sure, that's great, thanks.
So David is the founding director of Welcoming International. And this organization was actually founded to support local governments in turning their communities into more inclusive places. But David is also a social entrepreneur himself. So David, my first question to you would be in terms of, the work that your organization has done to develop some standards and frameworks to promote inclusion and welcoming communities. Can you give some examples of what you have done there and how you've supported, local authorities in implementing some of these frameworks or welcoming standards that you have set?
Sure. Happy to do that. And thanks for having me. And thanks for everyone for being here. Trying to go quickly. Yes, as far as this work, I really appreciated Liam's comments. Welcome International, we're an organization that works with international or national partners in Europe and across the world to advance inclusion. And the focus is the local level, but in all of our cases, we also help our national members to support networks of cities. So they're all connected together. So there is coordination, and also to define welcoming within their country, because New Zealand has a standard now for welcoming. Germany has a standard, but those are very different because they're very different places with very different realities. And so we help localities by supporting the creation of national level standards. And so if you take the example, well, first of all, we have a lot of different standards, and I can later add a link for some of the standards. But if you take the example here in Germany, the Bertelsmann Foundation and an organization called FINEO worked with cities across Germany on integration, and there was a lot of innovation, but there was no sort of map for how to advance together around integration and inclusion. There was no definition of success. And so we worked with Bertelsmann, we worked with FINEO to help them build that network, but also to help them to create what they call the Weltoffene self-check. So in some places, like in Australia, the national government runs the program, and those standards are actually there's an accreditation program to see how a city has advanced. In the German case, it's a self-check for cities to be able to see where they've gone, how they're going, and where they need to go. And so one gap in the German context is it's created a common language for all of the cities across Germany of what Weltoffene, what World Open or welcoming communities looks like. it's also, if you take the example, it works during COVID-19 too. So now that Germany has the standard, Bertelsmann and Fineo is working with 20 cities funded by the German government to scale the standard into those 20 cities, and then they're going to take it further and be supporting the work in 40 cities. But they were actually able to help many cities during, and they've been able to, during COVID, help a number of cities around integrating the standard. So there's a town called Kaiserslautern in southwest Germany. It's a town of 100,000 people, and they were able to bring all of the different stakeholders together from throughout that city, whether it's the municipal government, immigrants and refugees, and they were able to say, okay, here's a definition that a lot of you worked on of what welcoming looks like. How have you advanced on this? And what the person who's in charge of integration, who thought kind of it was all on their shoulders to do the integration in Kaiserslautern, realized, first of all, they understood better where they needed to go, where they were in relation to other German cities. But they also then had all of these different sectors at the table saying, we can help in this way, we can help in that way. And so they formed a task force. They did all of this with social distancing. They actually, some of these now are taking place virtually, but for them, they did it all with indoors, with the windows open, but also with a lot of social distancing. But they actually now have developed a plan together and a committee together to advance towards the Weltoffene standard. And so just to say one last thing around standards, and then I'll stop, is that standards, when they're created on the national level, they help to define success, but they also help with scaling and sustainability. And so once you're able to demonstrate that a city that is welcoming, that has met the standard, is more successful. In the US, we have a lot of cities that are certified. And because the city of Dayton in Ohio, for example, is certified, now more companies want to move to Dayton because they want their employees to feel welcome. They want their those spouses and everyone else to feel welcome so they can attract talent better. And so if you have a standard and you can demonstrate all these benefits to the standard, then you go from one city in the US to 200 cities in the US, or you go from one city in Germany to 40. And so I could talk more about the work that we're doing in Spain and the United Kingdom, but for now, I'll just stop there because I want to be fair to the other speakers. So thank you.
Thank you, David. And indeed, very interesting about the standards that you mentioned, because many municipalities, also miss a framework. So I'm sure that this is very welcome. Now, I was wondering how, the COVID-19 comes in here. Liam already mentioned the inclusive, social innovation, but I'm also wondering how can we make, the post-pandemic recovery an inclusive one? Any ideas on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about the planning and making the process inclusive. So I was going to also be speaking about the community-wide planning, but again, I want to be fair around time. But I'll just say quickly, because we work with the city of Tenerife, or the island of Tenerife in the Canary Islands in Spain. And so Tenerife wanted to do multi-sector planning. They wanted to bring all of the sectors together and identify what the barriers that people were facing, immigrants were facing to full inclusion, and then work to eliminate those barriers, whether they were cultural, because we can help them with that, or institutional, what were the laws and the policies that were keeping immigrants from participating fully. Now, because of the pandemic, every city's thinking and every community needs to start thinking about recovery. And so the work that they're doing now around bringing the sectors together, first of all, they're doing it virtually. And because they have a lot of trust in the community, they're doing it well virtually and inclusively virtually. But they're also framing it a little differently. And so they're framing it as not just inclusion planning, but inclusive recovery planning. And so if you're going to plan for recovery, because every city, whether it's an economic recovery or other types of recovery, there's going to need to be planning done. And if that planning is done, you need to make sure that it's inclusive planning, that everybody, immigrants and refugees, other sectors are included, because you need to make sure that all those voices are heard, and you need to make sure that the methodologies that you use to advance your recovery plan are going to address the barriers that would keep people like immigrants or refugees from being part of that recovery. And so it's multi-sector planning still, but it's now framed a little bit differently, and you're thinking about it in terms of recovery. But the standards, just like this work, help communities identify where they are on inclusion, and it also helps them to identify how to move forward an inclusive recovery. So whether it's, I'll share some tools around community-wide planning, and I'll also share some more tools around the standard because it's all very relevant to this moment. So,
it's all very relevant indeed, David. And if you don't mind, I also like to invite you to use the chat to perhaps share the links to your website or any interesting, tools that participants could look at. I'm also seeing in the chat that there's a reaction from one of the participants who is saying that despite expectations to the contrary, we had no infections in our undocumented population for whom a special quarantine shelter had been reserved, only 2 in our 600 people-packed asylum seeker shelter, and also from autonomously housed refugees. So it seems that in the end the situation was better managed than expected, but I think the experiences are a bit different between different cities, different localities, and that's also why it's now good to hear the experience in the city of Palermo, what happened there. So thank you, David, for your contribution. It was very interesting, and if you agree, we'll move on to the next speaker in the panel, Roberta Lo Bianco, please.
Hello, panelists and hello, participants.
Hello, Roberta.
Hello.
We're very happy that you could join us because we know that you are working in the city of Palermo, and that you coordinate, a number of projects on socioeconomic inclusion of migrants in Sicily. And I was really wondering, in Palermo, there is, of course, a very specific situation. There are lots of newcomers who are very young migrants, even unaccompanied minors. How are you dealing with that, and what are some of the initiatives for this particular group? And the second question, of course, is again, related to the COVID-19. How did it impact, the city of Palermo, and particularly, this young group of migrants? Did it have any, impacts that you can share with us, and how did you try to respond to that?
Okay, I will try to be short.
Thank you, Roberta.
It's a complex. There are complex questions. Yeah, I want to clarify that my position is particular because it's true that I'm the coordinator of this unit. I'm a project manager, but I'm also a worker dealing every day with the beneficiaries, with migrant young people. So I have this double soul. No, and that it helps me a lot to understand really what is happening in the territory. And well, about the situation of, as everybody knows, Sicily, Italy is the Sicily. I want to talk about East Sicily because it's a region that hosts since 2012 a huge number of newcomers, and mainly young unaccompanied minors. Now not anymore, but just because they are now older, and young boys and girls. And it's true that there are several initiatives have been implemented in the years by my organization, but also by other organizations, associations, often joined in partnerships in order to join energies and offer concrete and more stable solutions. But I want to just talk quickly about this project, Ragazzi a Raga, which was somehow represents a turning point from a welfareism logic approach to proposing a more a model of social accompaniment for unaccompanied minors and young boys and girls towards autonomy. Because in Palermo, the reception system was good, but was having an approach really assistantialist, not working on the fostering of autonomy. And Araga, which is a project coordinated by CHAI, but with a strong partnership in Palermo, started from a very deep analysis where immigrants, young boys and girls participated since the beginning. This was one of the strengths of this project, because instead of assuming, this is something that so often happens, which are the needs of those people, even if you work deeply in the ground, but instead of assuming which were the needs, we try to understand and listen, even like investing time, more time than the normal time that each organization usually has for developing projects. And and this project, I mean, it's really complex because it's made by 5 actions and 5 solutions after identifying 5 main challenges boys and girls that in 2017-18 were experiencing. But what I would like to underline is what we learned from this project, and it's true that it's ended, but we built up like kind of follow-up projects, which are EU projects, national projects, but they are like the lessons learned are now part of our daily work.
And Roberta, because you talk about the young migrants and how were they impacted by the COVID-19? Because I would imagine that a lot of the work you are doing is also in direct contact with the youth. Was this impacted due to the pandemic? Because we often hear that, you know, for young people, let's say the isolation was much harder than for families. How did you experience that?
Of course it had really a strong impact, a negative impact. But first of this COVID pandemic, there were the decree like established by the ex-minister of Interior, by the states, that had a stronger impact than the COVID. So, I mean, really. So we at Palermo,
we have to put things into perspective.
The organizations and the civil society and the public authorities that really, thanks of the previous project, have established a strong network. They made a lot of activities in order to let them going towards autonomy. But then due to the decree, that what we have done together with them has been stopped, has been really destroyed. In this context, the pandemic made worse the situation in Palermo, in Sicily. We know well that the economic situation is really like fragile. And at work level, the young people who were working but not having a regular job contract during the pandemic, due to the fact that many restaurants, many places were closed, they lost their jobs. And without any guarantees, no. So because they did not have a regular job contract. But then young people who were students, they found themselves behind because they were, for various reasons, they were not able to follow this online teaching. And this was really terrible, because, and then the Prefectura gave some guidelines, especially in terms of like how to prevent the diffusion of the pandemic, especially for the unaccompanied minor, for the minors living in communities. And what happened is that Prefectura said, authorize the responsible of centers to lock the minors in the community in order to do not allow them to go out. This made really a messy situation, as probably everybody can imagine, because people inside, those minors inside the community, develop many psychological distress. And it happened.
Yeah, Roberta, I think that must have a strong impact on the minors. I can only imagine. But also what you mentioned in terms of education, indeed, Mr. Schwarz already alluded to that at the start, that we see still a big gap between people with a migrant background in terms of education achievements, employment, and as you rightly said, the impact of COVID can even, exacerbate such differences, because, for migrant youth, it's much more difficult maybe, to get support in the homeschooling, to even have the right tools. And they're also often the first ones indeed to lose their jobs. So thank you, Roberta, for this contribution. It's very interesting to hear about, the situation on the ground in Palermo. We will now move to the last speaker in our panel, which is Maria Amélie. And Maria Amélie is a co-founder of Startup Migrants, founded in 2018 in Oslo to support cities in fostering migrant entrepreneurship. And the goal is really to show the positive effect that migrant entrepreneurs have on the wealth in Europe, on innovation, and the good that they do for our societies. Maria Amélie is also a writer and a migrant herself. So Maria, please join us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, we can see you. Very good. So Maria, you work specifically on migrant entrepreneurship and the local level, and you try to support municipalities in facilitating migrant entrepreneurship. Could you maybe explain to us how exactly migrant entrepreneurship can be facilitated at a local level, and perhaps also linked to that, what are some of the main barriers you could see?
Thank you. It's been very, very interesting to follow the discussions and the chat questions as well. Yeah, there's a lot of knowledge in this group here. So we started Startup Migrants for almost 2.5 years ago, and the reason for that was I'm a migrant myself. I'd actually been both a refugee. I've also been undocumented for some years in my life, and a work migrant. And now I'm waiting for my Norwegian citizenship finally. So all this life experience and also my work with entrepreneurship led me to explore this topic. Our migrants, explore whether migrants are actually innovating a lot in Europe. And what I have discovered is that there is very often this mantra or this mentality in public sector, especially in Norway, but also in other countries, that migrants have to get a job. You have to get a job. And then when we looked at the statistics for how many migrants are creating businesses in Europe, in different countries, different cities, we discovered that migrants are actually creating jobs. So one of the obstacles is actually that we need to challenge the public sector, the people who are in the first line of receiving and meeting migrants, is to change their mentality, because migrants are job creators. And it's something about that when you're new in a country, you see things from completely different perspectives, so you can actually come up with different innovative solutions. So
that's very interesting, Maria, because indeed, I think we often forget that, migrants are actually indeed also creating jobs and bring a lot of the innovation to our society.
Yeah, exactly. And so what we've seen, we've done a couple of things. And one of them was actually together with the Welcoming International. We looked into 3 German cities and whether they are succeeding or failing when it comes to migrant entrepreneurship. And we've also, right now, just this week, we started a project with the city of Oslo, where we went into a neighborhood that is where there are a lot of migrants, and the unemployment is high because of the coronavirus. recession. So what we've done, for example, in German cities, is that we kind of created a model based on all the data and all the things we've learned of what is typical for successful cities where migrants are really thriving. And what is very typical is that you have this sort of talent pipeline. You don't have just one social innovator who's doing lots of good things. You have strong collaboration between public, private sector and the NGOs, where you have in the first round, you have people who are actually meeting migrants in the first line, either job centers or refugee camps, and people who know, and then the second line, you have people who are helping migrants to actually verify their ideas. It can be a business course or some kind of chamber of commerce. And then the third sector, or you have this environment, like this startup ecosystem, or basically like incubators. You have places where people can work on their ideas and get mentors and etc. So what we see, for example, in some German cities is that they have very strong first line where they receive migrants, but then they don't know what to do with them. Mm-hmm. They might use entrepreneurial talents, but they don't know where to send them further down this pipeline. So that's what we've been working on in Oslo with Oslo municipality, is to make them aware of what there is in the ecosystem. And we've met people who work with, for example, welfare systems, and they meet migrants, and then some of them say, oh, I want to start a business. And then they're like, oh, I don't know what to do. I don't know anything about it. So I'll just, they just say to people, you have to just get a job. So already in this first line, there's a lot of entrepreneurial talent that can be discovered and can be sent further down this pipeline.
Yeah, very interesting concept, the talent pipeline. It reminds me a bit of what we heard this morning about the talent partnerships. I think the idea here indeed is how can we create fertile grounds for migrants to thrive, because migrants can bring innovation. Migrants, can be entrepreneurs, but indeed, systems have to be in place at a local level to make sure that, these talents can also be supported, and that, migrants get the opportunities to bring the best they can to our societies. So thank you so much, Maria Amélie, for sharing your experience. Feel free also to use the chat if you want to maybe provide a link to startup migrants, so participants, can go and have a look and perhaps explore a bit further some of the ideas you shared with us. So with this, I see that we are coming to the end of our webinar. It was extremely interesting to hear from the three panelists here on social innovative practices at a local level. But of course, I also thank our other speakers from earlier on, Mr. Schwartz, Rosella Chelmi, Liam, for your presentations, and all the participants for your interaction, for your questions. Just to remind everyone that we are also tweeting. You will see the hashtags in the chat. Please feel free to retweet to share also the results of our research. And finally, also this webinar has been recorded, so if you missed any part, don't worry, we will share after the webinar the link to the recording as well as the publication that was launched today. Of course, Admin for All will continue its work at a local level, and we hope to be back to you with more information and further webinars in the future. But for now, I thank you very much for your presentation, and I wish you a very good rest of the day. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.